we've seen small models of Native people and how Native people represent themselves in the form of dolls. But let's take a look at some actual real clothing that was worn by Native people. These three objects. This is Ojibwe, this is Potawatomi, and the far shirt is Seminole from Florida. These objects are all pieces that actual Native people wore. They were not manufactured for outside wear at all. And for that reason, there is honestly a lot of wear and tear on them in a way that a lot of tourist objects don't necessarily exhibit. But some of the things that I'd like to point out to you are what these objects are made of. First of all, this Ojibwe shirt from Minnesota or Wisconsin is made of red wool. It's trade wool. Glass beads, and has red velvet flocking on the placket, and has a hem, a little stitch of silk. So these are all imported materials. Again, this is a man's shirt. It would have been made by a woman for a man close to her. And yet, given all of these imported materials, given a basic shirt form that in many regards is Western, this object manages to be inherently Ojibwe. Look at all of the florals decorated in the front, all of these beautiful Anishinaabe forms. And this would be the first thing that you see when you see the person wearing this, is this amazing object. It probably would have been cinched at the waist by a sash, like one of the beaded sashes that we've seen previously. So the point of clothing, dress clothing in Native America is really to completely envelop one in one's own culture. You become a walking representation of your culture in traditional Native clothes, which is why you see these clothes, it's why they're formal clothes. It's why you see them busted out at ceremonial times and at extremely public times. So you see them during powwow, you see them during formal religious events, and you see them when Native people go to meet outside foreign ambassadors. This is especially when these things are worn. So this is Anishinaabe. This piece is a prairie object. It is Potawatomi. It's probably from Wisconsin, but it represents a kind of style shift that happens in southern Wisconsin, in through Illinois and Iowa. These are the prairie peoples. They're not quite woodland peoples, and they're not plains peoples. There are a tremendous number of Mississippian resonances in these objects. You'll see high bilateral symmetry in the beadwork, and you see these abstracted floral designs, which in my opinion are relatable to the mace designs that you see at the bottom here. As you can see, when you turn this object around, that bilateral symmetry becomes even more intense. You have these beautiful floating forms that are abstracted florals or abstracted Mississippian symbols. This object is really interesting to me because in the prairie, there is a lot of experimentation with beads. You see on this piece not only the usual small seed beads, but also these much longer bugle beads that can be seen here. And as you can see on the sleeve, there's this really cool little design with these floating pastille beads and bugle beads surrounding them, little suns, little stars. And then there's loom beaded work at the edge of the object that terminates in a kind of sash that just stays on the shirt. It has lovely Venetian wedding cake beads at the ends with little wool tassels. This is a woman's shirt. It would have come with a matching skirt that would also have a series of very similar beadwork motifs all over the skirt. It would have been worn with leggings. It's a virtuoso object, and it is absolutely a luxury object. So this is the kind of thing that a woman would have danced in or posed for a formal photograph in. What we have here is a man's Florida Seminole big shirt. This object is probably from the first decade of the 20th century, so from around 1900 to 1910. These are really phenomenal objects, and it's wonderful that the Hood has this piece in its collection. This man's shirt is so old that it predates the patchwork that Florida Seminole people are famous for. What it is instead composed of are bands of color and pieces of applique at the shoulder. The object itself is made of extremely light cotton, like almost a poplin. I hear people sometimes wonder about how Seminoles in the heat of the glades, the heat and the humidity of the glades, could wear so much clothing. Like, why didn't they wear just basically nothing? The fact of the matter is that this stuff is actually extremely light. A lot of these men's shirts were white, so reflective, and they keep the mosquitoes off. Many of these older shirts, before men started wearing pants, extended down to the ankles or were worn with leggings. This kept sawgrass from biting into your feet and your legs. So they're actually relatively practical for the environment. It's just that we're not used to thinking of them that way. And few of us ever get the opportunity to wear something like this in a hot environment. It's really an extraordinary object, and it's in great condition for its age. Something that the study of Seminole clothing is really wonderful for is tracking evolution, because Seminole clothing changed at a very rapid pace in the 20th century, to the point where you can map changes by decade. This, because of its absence of patchwork clothing, which started in the 19-teens, can be dated to around 1900, 1910. The doll that we saw that is representative of a man in a formal big shirt can be dated to the 1940s, because the shirt itself is longer and there are bands of patchwork all over it. The bands of patchwork themselves can be dated to within a decade. As the years wear on in the 20th century, Seminole patchwork becomes progressively more complex and more designs get added. Some of the recent design evolutions include the inclusion of clan symbols in patchwork. There is kind of an argument in Seminole studies over why patchwork. Was it like privation clothing, like they could only make stuff out of strips? It is clear that Seminoles were visiting Stranahan store and a few other friendly white stores in the area. So there was plenty of options, but color doesn't seem to come into it. There is a type of man's shirt that is cut different from this and always red, and it's a doctor's shirt. So it does appear that there were some occupational shirts among men. Otherwise, color doesn't really play into it. One thing that I think is really cool about this shirt is that it does have the color scheme of the current Florida Seminole and Florida Miccosukee Indian national flags in it, which are the medicine colors. And I really love that about the shirt.